Okay, welcome everybody, and thanks for this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about how to manage your research data and data privacy at the university. Let me just get my presentation back. Okay, we're going to be 4 co-presenters today that are presenting from or representatives of the different research support divisions at the university. And we are all working together to implement the research data and data privacy regulations on campus. And the 4 presenters today will be myself from the Division for Research Development, Samuel Simango from Library Information Services, Hilda Creer from IT, and Jerusha Naidu from Information Governance. I will start off by introducing the research data management regulations, go into the roles and responsibilities of researchers and other role players at the university, and then how researchers should manage their research data throughout the research project lifecycle. And then I'll list a couple of tools and resources that are available as well to researchers. Then I will hand over to Samuel, who will talk about external funder requirements and other provisions of the research data management regulations. And Hilda will tell us more about the research Ict Commons and service desks. And Jerusha will end the presentation with some data privacy regulations and how researchers must manage their data privacy in compliance with the specific national and international privacy legislation. And she will talk about the information management framework at the university. So the research data management definition that we use in the research data management regulations is firstly to plan for the way in which the research data will be managed during and after the research process or the research project. And what we include, what I underlined here, is that it includes the research data management after the research project has been finalized, which is a really important part of your data management, and that is sometimes neglected or just ignored completely. Furthermore, the research data management is also controlling the collection and processing, analysis, etc., of your research data. So research data management is a core principle of good research practice and scientific integrity. And you all have probably been doing it since you started your research. So why do we need the research data management regulations specifically? It enables compliance. Firstly, to a we have legal obligations. There are national and international privacy legislation like the POPIA in South Africa and the General Data Protection Regulations in the European Union that we have to comply with. Then we have ethical responsibilities. Of course, we work with research participants and we must make sure that we protect their privacy. We also have a responsibility towards scientific validity and integrity, informed consent, etc. And that all comes into our ethical responsibilities. Then we also have contractual requirements that we have to comply with. If you do research and you have a grant or a research contract, your funder will have specific requirements and we need to make sure that we comply with those. And then we also have our own institutional requirements that we have to comply with. Very important to remember that non-compliance can have severe financial repercussions in the form of fines that the university will have to pay, and then it can cause reputational damage to the university and maybe stop future funding opportunities from taking, or your opportunity to actually get some further financing from different funders if we don't comply. The regulations also provide a foundation to define the principles of RDM governance, and it also provides a framework to define the responsibilities of the university members with regard to the research data management. It also guides researchers and students in best research data management practices. So the research data management regulations were approved by Senate in 2020, and we've been implementing adopting it since last year. So we've been doing our roadshow and trying to make researchers aware of it. And a very important thing that researchers must be aware of is that we do have research support divisions that can assist, guide, and train researchers to comply um, in all different phases of research in the research project. So the research data management regulations are also part of the research governance framework of the university and must therefore be read in conjunction with other Stellenbosch University policies, and these are listed in the research data management regulations. So the model that describes and identifies the steps to be taken at the different stages of the research cycle is called the research data life cycle. It starts with data management and planning, then goes over to collection and processing and analysis of the data, and then the data is shared or disseminated or published or whatever the format is, and then it can be reused, and then the cycle starts all over again. Data curation takes place throughout the entire life cycle and entails the maintaining and the preservation of the research data. So the responsibilities and the roles of all researchers and the support divisions are included in the research data management regulations in section 15, and it's very clear who is responsible and accountable for what. And the range of skills and knowledge needed to deliver the research data management services by the different support divisions is dictated by the individual phases of the research project life cycle. And we've divided it into the planning phase, the execution phase, and then the post-project phase. And I will quickly just show you where exactly you can get assistance or guidance or training. Like the session that we're having now, there are several opportunities for researchers to get some more information and training. One important thing that I must mention now is that the university is the legal entity and is the legal owner of all research data. The university is also accountable to ensure that the research data is maintained and that there's access to specific research data materials in accordance with all the ethical and legal institutional rules and regulations that I just mentioned. But of course, it will be very unpractical to um, uh, if the university has to have the specific control over all research data of each and every research project. So the university therefore assigns that the principal investigator as the steward of the data, and the principal investigator will therefore be responsible and accountable for all research data management and the compliance to all the different rules and regulations. A second important thing before we start with a planning phase is to know that the core ethical principles apply to all research types. It's not only for clinical research or for research where you work with medical projects or medical based projects. If you are working with any research participants, even if you just ask people to complete a survey, there will be specific core ethical principles, and of course then towards biological and environmental safety as well. So the core ethical principles apply to everyone. Okay, so in the planning phase, that's the most important phase of a research project, as you know. And I said before, the principal investigator will be the data steward and will be responsible for the planning. And things that are taken into account here, it will be the good scientific practice, scientific integrity, of course, all the national and international and institutional policies and regulations, good project management skills, and you will use the scientific method to make a work plan or create a work plan and a work schedule. You will also need to, at the same time, at this stage, already plan your data management, because in the end you need to have a data management plan before you can start a project, and this is required of all research projects at Stellenbosch University. So right from the start, you are going to include in your project budget all the costs that are calculated from your work plan. You did a risk assessment, so you'll have a contingency plan, but you'll also need to include your data management activities in your budget from the start. And that can go into your funding proposal or whatever the case may be. So this is an important point, and this is where researchers sometimes get stuck. So the library and information services can help researchers to make a good data management plan and get all the information they need for their data management planning. And that will include the types of data that will be collected and how the data will be stored, metadata standards, etc. And then if there's any IP or ownership or access, the Division for Research Development will help researchers in that regard. The IT division will help with the ICT infrastructure, and that includes hardware and software and other tools. And they also have a cost calculator that researchers can use to calculate the costs of their data management, the management of their research data. So they can help with that, and that's going to be important for your budgeting. Then if you are going to collect, process, or reuse personal information, then information governance can help the researchers with a privacy impact assessment to see what the sensitivity or the risks are regarding the personal information that will be collected. Um, the researchers will need to apply for ethics committee approval, and that happens via the Division for Research Development. And IT can help researchers how to de-identify, encrypt, or securely store their files that contain personal information. So if the researchers are going to have a research contract that most researchers will have, then most funders nowadays have due diligence questionnaires that need to be completed before they will consider partnering with the university. The Division for Research Development help with those, and they will also make sure that the researcher understands the funder policy requirements, because funders sometimes have specific requirements in terms of research data management. Then the Division for Research Development Contracts Office will also be involved with the funding agreements, the research contracts, IPR agreements, etc. And if the research data will be transferred or shared between parties, they will help the researchers to set up a data transfer agreement. And all of these information will also need to go into your data management plan. The head of department is responsible for the governance and oversight of research data management in their environments. And this will include setting up specific departmental or discipline specific standards, and then procedures and frameworks within their environments or in their departments. When we go over to the execution phase of the research project, the principal investigator will be responsible for data collection, and this is just through the normal work plan, all the experiments, the observations, etc. And then the active data also needs to be captured and backed up, and metadata needs to be included there, and the IT division can help the researchers to decide on what type of software for active data storage can be used. Is there an electronic notebook or RedCap or whatever the case may be, and access control. The library information services will help researchers with metadata standards, file naming conventions, etc. And then the researchers will also be involved for the processing and analysis of the data, and library information services will also be there to assist them with interpretation of data, visualization of data, and how to prepare the data for publication. Which brings us to the next phase, and that is the post-project phase, where research may be published. Important to know here that if you have peer-to-peer transmission or publishing of data, then there might be a data transfer agreement that needs to be signed. The Division for Research Development will help there. Researchers must remember that research data that is published can also be cited, so they need to have an ORCID record for that. And the research data can be published in the Sun Scholar Data Repository, that is the university data repository. It can be supplementary data to to a published journal article. It can be published in a data journal, or it can be deposited in a third-party digital data repository. And all of these options can also be linked with Sun Scholar repository that the Library Information Services manage, and they will train and assist the researchers on how to do that. Data reuse, of course, when there's secondary data collection, the research data management cycle begins again. Important to remember that even if you use secondary data, the Research Ethics Committee approval might also be necessary there. So the Division for Research Development can help research to do that. Digital curation takes place through the entire life cycle of the project, and the Library Information Services are the specialists in helping the researchers to make sure that they've got their data readable in the long term and how they should store and preserve the research data of the project. All of these things are included in the Research Data Management Regulation, including the time period for which the research data must be kept available or preserved. So apart from the policies and the regulations that form part of the research data management framework at the university, we also have several platforms and tools that are either already available to researchers or are in preparation, and they are all listed in these tables, and you'll see the different divisions are responsible for different tools and platforms. Important to note that there are several training opportunities, and the web page of the Library Information Services is a good place to start. And then the Sun Scholar data that I already mentioned is the institutional research data repository. And then Samuel and his co-workers also developed a research data management adventure game. That is a really valuable way for researchers to actually learn more about research data management in their own research projects. So there are different tools and platforms available. The Research ICT Service Desk that Hilda is going to tell us more about is also active already, and researchers can send their requests to get some support with any research data management issue that they are experiencing, or specific requirements that their funders are requiring. So with that, I hand over to Samuel.
Thank you, Sarita. I'm going to share my screen now. Just give me a second. All right, can I have confirmation if my screen is visible, everyone? Can anyone confirm if you can see this?
We can see it. Thank you, Samuel.
All right, thank you. I'm going to be taking over from where Sarita left off. I just want to change this to full screen mode. You'll probably notice a few overlaps between what Sarita stated and what I'm going to mention. From the outset, I just wanted to point out that even though we'll mention a lot of compliance-related aspects, the main thing to keep in mind is also the fact that research data management is associated with the quality attributes of your research data as a researcher. So looking at assuring that the data are capable of supporting future analysis, assuring that all operations performed on the data are traceable, and facilitating future reuse by other researchers sometime in the future. Now, the first thing that I want to start off with is the external funder requirements, which researchers need to keep in mind. The RDM regulations do stipulate that where there are some kind of conflicts between the contents of the regulations on the one hand and funder requirements, the funder requirements actually take precedence. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind. It's extremely important because we're trying to ensure that there's some kind of compliance with the funder requirements. And what you see here are basically is a list of funders who actually have some kind of mandates regarding research. And one of these includes the creation of data management plans, which will be the next point that I actually want to discuss. It's very important that when researchers create their data management plans, and these are essentially plans that describe the manner in which research data will be treated during and after the research process, it's important that the principal investigators actually basically lead the charge in this respect. If there are any kinds of queries regarding research contracts that are associated with this process, the DRD can be contacted with that respect. It's also important that whenever a DMP is actually created, that is the data management plan, researchers need to factor into account the costs associated with storage of the research data during the research project as well as afterwards, so that when funding requests are made, the costs that will be associated with the data during the entire life cycle are actually accommodated. Now, the actual regulations themselves indicate that it's mandatory for all research to actually have data management plans, but it's particularly more important if the research in question actually has to get ethical clearance from one of the research ethics committees at the university, in which case the rec in question would actually request that a DMP be submitted as part of the ethics approval process. And I just created a diagram that sort of like maps out the various options or possibilities. There are instances where research funders do not necessarily request DMPs, and there's an issue of research not being funded. So if you look on the right-hand side, if the research is unfunded, that doesn't necessarily mean that a data management plan is not required. The university would have its own requirements in terms of which a researcher could actually create a data management plan using the university's DMP template. I should point out that such a template does not necessarily exist at the present moment, but that's how the regulations were actually framed. In the case of funded research, sometimes funders would actually have their own template on hand, and if that is the case, then researchers are advised to actually make use of the DMP template that is actually provided by the funder. If the funder wants a DMP to actually be utilized, then you can use their own. And if the funder does not necessarily have a template, then you use the university's own template. So essentially, these things are actually mapped out in terms of what decisions a researcher needs to take, as well as which specific template the researcher would actually make use of. It suffices to point out that at any given moment, there should at least be some template that is used for such purposes, especially for anyone requiring ethical clearance. Now, if we look at data acquisition and management, at this point, it's important to stress that the RDM regulations do not necessarily aspire to replace provisions in the governance documents that already existed at the universities, that is regulations and policies. They simply seek to plug in certain gaps that did not necessarily make mention of research data, or that did not explicitly apply to research data. So the document itself does actually make mention to other documents explicitly, such as the policy for responsible research conduct, the data privacy regulations, the IP policies, the research ethics related SOPs, etc. So that's something to actually keep in mind. But the core thing to remember is that the research data should actually be managed in a secure manner. And this does take into consideration the different methodologies that are actually utilized by different researchers in different disciplines. The research data are actually owned by the university in terms of the university's IP policy. So this is not necessarily something that would change. And it's obviously very important to ensure that data transfer agreements are actually used whenever the research data are transferred to other institutions. Now, a very important thing that I want to stress relates to the data categories and storage requirements that are outlined in the RDM regulations. The regulations stipulate, or rather they recommend, the types of storage media which researchers should actually use, and they identify the preferred options. So mainly researchers are not advised to make use of portable storage. There is an exception to this if the data are encrypted, and this is really under exceptional circumstances. But the preference is given to institutional storage that is managed by Stellenbosch University's IT division or the Library and Information Service. And the images that you see on the screen actually represent the storage options. There's SunScholar Data, Microsoft OneDrive for Business, and Microsoft Teams. And it's important to stress that these should be the institutional Microsoft OneDrive and Microsoft Teams as opposed to the third-party options. So third-party cloud storage solutions are actually discouraged for security purposes. Now, when it comes to the sharing and publication of data, the RDM regulations do actually have certain stipulations. Researchers are obviously permitted to share their data, but such data sharing should actually take place in a secure manner. And the images that you see on the screen actually depict the data sharing platforms that can actually be used. In this case, as RedCap. Researchers can use FileSender, Microsoft OneDrive, as well as Microsoft Teams. Once again, these are the institutional versions of Microsoft Teams and OneDrive, rather than institutional tenants. Now, it's important to keep in mind that if data are going to be transferred between Stellenbosch University and another institution, then a data transfer agreement must actually be used. And for further advice in this respect, researchers are advised to contact the DRD's Research Contracts Office. So Rita already covered some of the aspects relating to data publication, but I just want to highlight a few other things. So Rita did mention that researchers can publish their data via third-party repositories, via data journals, and a supplementary data that actually accompanies journal articles. What I wanted to indicate, something that's not necessarily explicitly stated in the regulation, the fact that such data should actually be linked to the university's research data repository, SunScholar data. That way we sort of have some kind of data catalog of all the research data that are actually being generated by the university, at least that are being published by the university. So the university does recognize that there are different access levels that should actually be associated with research data. Not all research data are actually capable or should actually be published. That would not be a desirable outcome. So you have open classifications, private access classifications, restricted, as well as research data that are actually under embargo. And you have a range of degrees of openness associated with the research data. So this is something that is accommodated by the RDM regulations. This is very important because researchers do usually ask the question about sensitive research data and what they should do about that. Such sensitive research data obviously cannot be made open because that would be regarded as restricted research data. When it comes to data retention, the RDM regulations indicate that if you were to publish the research data, your research data on SunScholar Data, the institutional data repository, the data would be held for a minimum of 10 years. So that's a very important consideration to keep in mind. If the research data are not stored on the repository, they still need to be stored in a secure manner. And at this point, I should highlight that the research data that are published on SunScholar Data should not be sensitive in nature due to any restrictions based on research contracts, intellectual property, or be it ethics or data privacy related concerns. Now let's move on to the ethical considerations and the use of research data. As I indicated previously, the RDM regulations do not seek to actually replace what has already been stated in the research ethics SOPs. So these are mentioned in the RDM regulations, but to a large degree, they operate as is. Where there's something that has not been mentioned in these documents, the RDM regulations do explicitly indicate what needs to be addressed, and I will cover this in the coming slides. The main thing that that is mentioned relates to the management of sensitive data. So the RDM regulations stipulate that whenever resource data are collected from human participants, the researchers in question need to actually make sure that they conduct some kind of disclosure, risk-associated disclosure assessment during, before, and after the research. And the regulations explicitly mention that privacy impact self-assessment can actually be conducted. There's a tool that was actually created by the Division of Information Governance, which addresses this, and the screenshot that you see on the screen actually shows you an image of what this tool looks like, or at least the questionnaire itself looks like. And this is very important because it generates results that actually identifies a risk profile associated with the research data, whether it's low risk, medium risk, or high risk. And that enables support staff at the university to determine the most appropriate data storage option to use for such research data. Another thing that's mentioned relates to the use of secondary research data that are sensitive in nature. Once again, the data transfer agreement must actually be used in this case as per the requirements of the RDM regulations. And for further advice on this, researchers are encouraged to contact the DRD's Research Contracts Office. Now, the last thing that I would like to cover relates to legal requirements. The provision that actually addresses this in the RDM regulations is relatively short, and this is primarily because the bulk of the content is actually addressed in external documents, that is in legislation to a large degree. But I'll just mention the branches of the law that the document actually alludes to. Firstly, it relates to intellectual property aspects such as copyright, patents, trade secrets, and licenses. Some of these will be addressed at the institutional level. If you look at the IP policy, it actually does address these types of issues at the institutional level, which is why the RDM regulations do not necessarily go into great detail addressing this aspect. Secondly, there's the issue of data privacy. At the South African level, nationwide, this is addressed in terms of the POPIA, the Protection of Personal Information Act, and internationally, you also have to consider the General Data Protection Regulations from the EU. At the institutional level, this is addressed in the Stellenbosch University Data Privacy Regulations, and this is why, to a large degree, there isn't so much content about the legal considerations within the RDM regulations. There's the issue of access to information. At the legislative level, this is addressed by the Promotion of Access to Information Act. I believe that my colleague Jerusha will address this in a bit more detail during her presentation. But at this point, what I wanted to point out is that when the RDM regulations allude to adhering to or complying with access to information, such reference is made in relation to the Promotion of Access to Information Act. Then lastly, there's the issue of research contracts that's also mentioned under the legal requirements heading. In this respect, this is something that is addressed to a large degree by the DRD. This isn't something that is actually new. As you can see from the screenshot here, taken from the DRD's website, the DRD has been working with research contracts, different types of research contracts for several years, which is why we didn't actually put a lot of details about this aspect. And the screenshot here shows you the different types of contracts that actually exist. But the main thing that one should just keep in mind is that when the RDM regulations make reference to legal requirements associated with research contracts, one can contact the DRD to find out about more information about how they can comply with such requirements, because the DRD actually works with these issues, primarily the Research Contracts Office. And with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. I will now hand over to Hilda to continue. In fact, I'm going to share my screen first. Hilda, are you still around with us right now?
I am Samuel, thank you.
All right, great.
I'm quickly going to share my screen. There we go. I hope it's showing. Holla if it's not. Okay. Hello, colleagues. My name is Hilda. I coordinate support for the research-related information systems within the IT division. You would have heard that Samuel and Sarita mentioned that there are quite a number of responsibilities that our researchers have regarding following good practice in terms of research data management. We realize very well that researchers can only follow this good practice if they have the necessary tools to do so. So what we are working towards, and if I say we, it's the IT division in collaboration with all of the research support divisions and also in collaboration with individual researchers and research groups, is to grow what we call a research ICT Commons. So that is a collection of infrastructure, of applications, of software, of platforms that will meet the requirements of the majority of our researchers. So the idea is not that the Research ICT Commons will meet the requirements of highly specialized use cases, but the Commons should at least meet the requirements of the basic requirements of the majority of our researchers. And in addition to that, the idea is that the Commons should be offered to our researchers for free or at very limited cost. So what we are doing is we are populating this research ICT Commons with a whole selection of services and tools. And as Sarita mentioned, we are using the research data management lifecycle to structure this in a systematic way. So we are working towards providing tools that will enable our researchers at every step of the research life cycle. I'm not going to go through all of the tools in detail. It will be useful to mention that there are different security mechanisms implemented for the various tools, which means not all tools are fit for purpose for data with all kinds of sensitivity classifications. So if I may use an example, we would recommend, for example, that for identifiable high-risk data, you use RedCap to collect your data. And for medium risk data or low risk data, you can consider something like Sun Surveys, for example. Then as Samuel mentioned, we recommend for data storage the use of the various components within the Microsoft 365 stack. So if you are storing data that only you need access to and your supervisor, for example, then you will use something like OneDrive. Again, as Samuel mentioned, to make sure that it's the what we call the institutional instance of OneDrive. So the one where you use your SU username and password to log in, and not the one that you can get for free when you sign up for Microsoft in your personal capacity, for example. Or if you are collaborating with other research groups or colleagues within the university or even with external collaborators, then we find that a Microsoft Teams site, for example, meets the requirements of most of our research groups. In terms of something like Power Apps, here I can mention that we also collaborate with our postdocs. For example, Dr. Kim Martin, who is presently growing a research software engineering group at Stellenbosch University. So for those details, you can also reach out to me. So to assist researchers to build data pipelines or to use Python or R, for example. Then in terms of software, we have a number of software packages in our commons. Here we're looking at things like MATLAB and Atlas TI. We also have our Stellenbosch University High Performance Computing Cluster, and our cluster manager can advise researchers on how to make use of the National High Performance Computing Cluster, the CHPC. And then, as Samuel mentioned, SunScholar data for the hosting of passive research data. So once a research project has concluded, we're also very much aware of the fact that our toolbox is not complete yet. We, for example, do not have a solution in place at the moment to store very large passive data sets or sensitive passive data sets that cannot be made publicly accessible. So all of the time we are working towards adding more tools to the toolbox. As Samuel mentioned, we are currently doing a request for information to identify a fit for purpose data management planning solution. Our ops team is conceptualizing a custom database hosting service. So all of these things we are constantly working on to add to our toolbox. So the green donuts in the middle are some of the solutions we have in the commons, and then the outer donut are those solutions that are research group specific. So what we call our specialisms, our highly specialized applications, things like GEMS or SAURAN, or the CEF cluster we're building for Tygerberg, in collaboration with the team there. So the services we offer to research groups who need highly specialized solutions, we can assist them to unpack their requirements and to document it in a form of a requirement specification so that the research groups can systematically evaluate the different solutions that are out there. We can advise when it comes to the request for information or the request for proposal processes. Where capacity allows, we can assist with project management. We also often work with our legal specialists in the Division for Research Development and the and SU Legal to look through data processing agreements and advise on the tools that funders or research contract partners will be satisfied with when it comes to storing and managing data. Then if research groups are implementing their own solutions, we can work with them to implement SU authentication mechanisms, so to enable them to use their SU username and password to log into third-party applications. And then we also often advise on service level agreements. So to make sure that a external vendor not only implements a solution for you and then they disappear, but that they also make sure that the solution is sustainably maintained. Then we've established what we call our Research ICT Service Desk, again in collaboration with all of the other research support divisions. And if you have questions about any of the tools in our toolkit, or if you have a requirement that cannot be met by our toolkit, you are welcome to log a request here, and we will rope in all of the relevant specialists to try and answer you as quickly as possible. From my side, that is all. So I'm going to hand over to Jerusha now. Thank you for your time, colleagues.
Thank you, Hilda and colleagues. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint presentation up, and we can take it from there. Okay. I'm going to take it on good faith that you guys can hear me and that you can see the slides in front of you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerusha, and you've all done exceptionally well in keeping focus on this very important topic. I am not with the DRD. I'm with a different division within Stellenbosch University, the Division for Information Governance, but you will soon see how the processes align together with your research objectives. So for today, we're going to be looking at some definitions. We're going to look at a different piece of legislation than what we're used to. We're looking at the Promotion of Access to Information Act together with the Protection of Personal Information Act, as well as a brief touching on the General Data Protection Regulations, which is from the EU that our colleague Samuel also mentioned in his presentation, as well as Sarita mentioned in her presentation. We're also going to talk about SU's approach to information management and where we are in that process. And thereafter, I think if there are any questions, we can handle those questions as part of the larger discussion together with the other specialists on the call. Okay, who am I? A lot of you might know me as the Poppy Lady. I don't hate the name. I don't love it, but it is what it is. So through our past interactions, we may have had discussions within your departments or within your faculties on POPIA and the changes that it brings to the way that we do research, but also the way that we process personal information on our campus. So with that in mind, our division is responsible for the operationalization of both POPIA and PIA. So we have put together a framework for the governance of personal information. This is part of our institutional response and its duty under law, as well as institutional standard operating procedures in order to handle other access to information requests under the Promotion of Access to Information Act. Right, having said that, privacy and access to information are not isolated fields or disciplines, but are parts of a larger integrated landscape of information processing, which is a very mouthy way of saying they do not exist on their own. They coexist together with the other disciplines. The beauty of privacy, however, is that it's largely common sense. So it's quite easy to follow and to maintain and to implement. We want to give an effect to the right of privacy, and we want to give effect to the right of access to information, both of these rights which are entrenched in the South African Constitution. And therefore, we are formulating policies and institutional procedures which benefit this institution, and the benefit exceeds beyond simple compliance. You will recall that Sarita mentioned in her presentation that non-compliance has a knock-on effect. So if we are non-compliant in this one area, it can have a knock-on effect in terms of research funding, in terms of our reputational risk outside of this institution, and it can even lead to SU being fined. So we will be discussing both these pieces of legislation as South African pieces of legislation, but keep today's discussion about information governance and management. Now to some fun definitions, or rather non-definitions. Within the privacy space, there's really no consistency in the terms used, such as information and data. They're often used as synonyms. You can have a look at some of the definitions found within the South African POPIA legislation and then compare it to the European General Data Protection Regulation. So you can see in my slides, I've kindly highlighted information versus data. And let's also bear in mind that POPIA defines a data subject as the person to whom personal information relates. And South African legislation is a bit different to the European legislation in that a data subject can also be a juristic person. So SU is also seen as a data subject. This does not translate into the European legislation at all. So we need to bear that in mind if we are working with European partners and ensure that our definitions are consistent with the research that we're trying to do. So you can just note that for yourselves. So in this discussion, I might use the term information, I might use the term data, but just see it as the overarching terminology that we use for how we relate to the information that is flowing, be it through research or through a research process. We look to international, globally recognized frameworks, and using that, we formulate our own internal privacy framework. We've looked to specifically COVID 2019, which is a globally recognized framework for the management of IT and processes. COVID standing for Control Objectives for Information and Related Technologies, a very mouthy governance term, but very, very interesting processes that they've put together, and the way they explain the framework is very easy to understand, and it's used nationally and abroad. And so in looking at the COVID framework, we've had to evaluate our stakeholder needs. We've had to direct action towards achieving the goals. We have to consistently monitor our progress, and this can be summed up in terms of plan, build, run, and monitor. So if one thinks of your research data, you would have to project manage in a very similar fashion to ensure that you're compliant, not only to what I'm telling you in terms of privacy law, but in terms of what the other colleagues have already said in their previous sessions. When one looks at the positioning of information governance, we are looking specifically to build bridges across SU as an organization and break down the siloed thinking and the current silos in operation. Information cannot exist in a silo on its own. There's always a free flow of information. There always needs to be a mapping of information, whether it is personal information or research information. So that is just a very important point to consider. When one looks at the literature, we have to see the different areas of influence. As I said in the beginning, privacy does not exist on its own. And here we can just see there are some areas that it overlaps with. And it is quite interesting to see how the outflow and the management of good privacy can have a knock-on effect in other areas and add value into other areas. Now back to our access to information piece of legislation. This ties directly into the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, and it refers to information held by the state or information that's held by another person and is required for the exercise or protection of any rights. So we have this piece of legislation which allows us to give access to certain pieces of information within reason. There will always be justifiable limitations. Samuel mentioned it in his presentation to us earlier, where he talked about third-party rights, your contractual rights with whoever you are co-researching, whatever your study is based upon. So we will ensure that there are agreements in place, that we have put protection mechanisms in place so that we don't reveal any information that would be a breach of privacy or a breach of commercial confidentiality. Having said that, you do need to note that even within your research, someone could request access from the university to your research. And we would ensure that we would approach it in a constitutionally respectful manner, while also weighing up the other rights at play. There are certain instances where the right of access to information would outweigh other rights, and that would be in a public interest. So think about if you discovered something that is potentially harmful to the rest of South Africa, SU would have a duty and would be duty bound to release that information in order to protect the general public. So these are very rare instances. It doesn't always occur, but it's worth noting that how you do your research and how you protect your research participants should be in a way that not only gives effect of their privacy rights, but if there was an instance where the access to information right outweighed it, we would need to get in touch with them in order to let them know that there is another piece of legislation that is being used to effect a different right. It sounds very entangled, but it's not really. It very rarely happens, but it's important to note. So POPIA is applying to a record of a public body. It also applies to a record of a private body, and it doesn't matter when that record came into existence. So think about any records that we may have in the archives. The POPIA Act has been used for people to access certain records within the SU archives, for example. We do have a standard operating procedure for POPIA requests that has been approved by our rectorate, and it's been approved earlier this year. And it talks about the statutory information officer, which is the rector and vice chancellor, who's ultimately accountable for POPIA compliance within SU. There are 2 deputy information officers. I am one, and I have a colleague, Jarrell, who's also responsible for the day-to-day handling of POPIA requests. What we seek to do with our information management regulation that will be coming out later this year is we will seek to appoint information curators within the different areas, and they would be able to assist us with the execution of when records are requested under POPIA. POPIA, again, is not the overarching piece of legislation, but it does talk to privacy concerns, and we manage those concerns as POPIA allows, and also in terms of the Protection of Personal Information Act. So we look at the information overall, and we understand that information has value and that it does follow an iterative life cycle. So for example, let's make it very practical. If I want to do research, but I only want to do research on the first year's, the cohort of 2022, and get their insights, I receive their insights as the cohort of 2022. Some of the information that I may have collected could be stale or could no longer be usable for for future research, in the sense of if we perhaps are looking at geographical location, they might not all live in this province anymore or in their province of origin. And so we've got to make sure that when we do our research planning, that we are planning for the whole of how we are going to use that data. So from inception until disposal or destruction of that data, we look at the entire life cycle of the information. And if there is information that has been collected and can be reused, and they have consented to that, or it's aligned to the initial purpose, then we should store it in a way that is responsible, bearing in mind the privacy principles, and we can use that de-identified data later, de-identified statistical data later. But we must always look at what value are we getting out of that data. So we should also have security in the forefront of our data collection, making sure that we are protecting our research participants, making sure that there's no unauthorized access to their information, or that if we are have a research assistant assisting us with the collection or the editing of pieces of information, that we are not losing information, that the information still retains its value. There will always be risks involved in the processing of personal information. And one of the tools that was mentioned by Samuel is the privacy impact self-assessment. If you go onto our webpage, it will route you to our service desk, and you are welcome to take the self-assessment even as a test for yourself to check how you intend to process information in your study. Earlier, I mentioned COVID, and specifically plan, build, monitor, and the disposal of the information. So we can see that from the beginning, we're planning out the information life cycle, we're planning out the use of that information, and once we have achieved the goals that we want to achieve with that information, we dispose of it in a responsible manner, either by archiving it or by destroying it. We need to always have justifications as to why we are processing information. We must be able to clearly articulate that to our research participants. We must be able to articulate the risks that are involved and any steps we've taken to manage and mitigate those risks. And we have to consider this before we process the information. Again, this is why I say, if you are considering to process information in a specific way, please do the self-assessment. If we see that it is medium to high risk, you will be referred to us within the Division for Information Governance. You're welcome to then set a separate appointment with us, and then we can discuss with you the plans that you have in place. We can check that you are complying to the legislation and that you've put sufficient protection mechanisms in place. When one looks at pieces of legislation, we can get very fearful that we would be non-compliant, either through negligence or just simply because we did not know. However, we need to make sure that we are enabled to comply with both POPIA and POPIA, simply because SU must comply to national legislation. So as a researcher, you would not be able to say that you do not have to comply with either of these pieces of legislation. As a South African citizen, you would have to comply, but also as a researcher, you would have to comply because it is the law. Okay. Now to our general data protection regulation. This is the overseas one that I spoke about with our European counterparts. And again, they have 6 lawful reasons for the processing of data. So these lawful reasons, you should only have to keep in the back of your mind if you're working with a European partner. In terms of South African legislation, we have very similar reasons, but these ones will come to the fore if you need to work with a European partner. And usually in terms of research, it would be contract-based with the European partner and then consent-based with your data participant. So you'll need to just very clearly have to explain that to your participant, but you'll also very clearly have to show true compliance. So we cannot say, yes, we will use that and then not follow through. You will need to please contact the DRD so that they can set up the appropriate approved contract and have sign off by the appropriate authority. Again, with our data protection impact assessment, that is the European term, and we have different subsets of personal information in South Africa. For example, we have special personal information where the European law does not have that. So although you can use the self-assessment and it will give you a very good idea, it might not be what your European co-researcher is looking for. It might not speak exactly to the potential risks. And so please, in instances where this becomes a concern, please reach out to the division and then we will run a full assessment with you. And it will be different to the one that is available online, but it will ensure that you are at least compliant to the GDPR requirement for this data protection impact assessment. In terms of POPIA and POPIA, and I've called it problematic meeting recordings. Not all meeting recordings are problematic, but we must remember that from the minute the recording is available, it becomes a record in terms of POPIA. And that record can be used by a requester for whatever purpose that they want. And so we need to make sure that when we are doing our recordings that people consent to the record that is being made, that we mitigate our risks if a recording is made just to keep minutes, that is done within a reasonable time and that then the recording is destroyed. If we cannot articulate the risks involved in making a recording, then we should be using different measures to manage and mitigate those risks or not making the recording at all. So that is just something very important for us to consider going forward. As I said previously, you know, this is an access to information. It can be a request, but in terms of privacy, people often state their opinions and their identity might be revealed and they may not want that, they may object to that. So that's just an important consideration going forward. Now, how do we tie all these different needs, all these different compliance requirements together? Well, IG has begun development of an information management framework, IG being information governance within Stellenbosch University. And so we are using this framework and it will support information policies and regulations. We've already held a few internal workshops and we are receiving input on the documents and on the policies, and we hope to have that ready and launched very, very soon. And that will discuss those information curatorship roles, and you will understand your role better as both a researcher, but also the holder of research information. And also in terms of where the information is then handed over to SU as the primary holder of the information at the end of the research. Thank you very much.